All right, so back here we're going to do the spark plugs, and in an earlier video I pointed to this cover, but I pointed incorrectly. The spark plugs are actually under this cover here, so I pulled these 4 bolts and this cover pops right off. Then there are the coils that sit on top of each of the spark plugs. So we're gonna reposition here a little bit. So I haven't done a motor like this before, but it's not a big deal. Basically what I'm gonna do is I'll pull each one of these plugs off. As you can see, it's tied into the electrical harness, and these have to come up and out after you loosen this bolt. So I'll pull each one of these guys, and I'm actually gonna pull this butterfly clip and pull this tube off and get it out of the way so I can work on this spark plug here. But real easy, and I'll put the video over here so you can see what I'm doing. So just like on the PCU out, I squeeze the clip, pull it up out of the way. I already pulled it out of its little holder here, and like I said, rotate it, and it makes it a lot easier instead of just pulling straight up. I can get that out of the way. These plugs are pretty easy. You just kind of push down on this little tab back here, and they should pull out fairly easily. It's not coming out as easily as I want it to. Let's try this guy. All right, so my clip isn't coming out as easily as I'd like, so I'm going to be very gentle with this little screwdriver. I can see the tooth right here that it needs to come off of. So usually these clips, if you push down on it, it'll disengage that piece. And if I push down real hard, I can see it wanting to move, but it's not coming off. So what I'm going to do is gently put this little screwdriver in here and pry that up, and it comes out. So I'm going to do that for all of them. All right, so you probably don't need to keep track and put each one of these back in the same spot that they were, but I want to, just because I'm paranoid. So I'm going to pull these out. I won't use this to put this back in, just in case it gets too crazy and blast it out. I'll probably gently start them with my hand, like so, and then use the gun to get them down, and then finish off getting them tight with the ratchet. So these should pull up and out now. You just want to be gentle, and you can see how I'm kind of rotating it a little bit, and it comes out. And that's what it should look like, and we can see that it's nice and clean, not any oil. If I look down in there, I just see a clean spark plug. That's really good. It means that nothing's coming up through the spark plug. No water's in there, no oil's in there. That's a great sign. And it's a little tight because the spark plug sits in this rubber boot right here. You can see that's what kind of engages the spark plug. So I'll pull all those and then show you how to pull the plug. All right, so as you can see, I got them all out. I just set them in a row, same order that they came out. And then if we look down in here, we can see the spark plug down in there. and they all look about the same as far as being clean. So what I'll do is I'll just put a wrench in there and start pulling them out. All right, so as I showed you before, they're kind of down in those holes where they're respectively seated into the cylinder. So you use a special spark plug socket, and inside here you can see there's a rubber grommet, and that'll help me get them out and also protect the spark plug itself from getting damaged on the socket. So basically I put it inside, I feel it engage with the plug, and then I use the ratchet to start loosening the plug, and hopefully they're not seized. So I pull, it's on there pretty good, but nothing to worry about. Maybe the guy who put them in before, I don't know, it might have over torqued them, but either way, I just get the ratchet going and then I turn it out by hand. And hopefully that little plug that I showed you in the socket will pull that spark plug out. I know a lot of people will use the ignition coil that I just showed you, that I pulled out, as something to get those out as well. But we'll see if this socket's going to do its job. And it did. There we go. That's one out. We'll go through the rest and I'll show you. All right, so I'm going to get the rest of these plugs out. You know, it's interesting to think about, but I'm sitting here making a video on how to do this, and I've actually never changed spark plugs on a motor like this. This is a very different setup than what I'm used to with, say, the Chevelle or even any of the pickup trucks that I've owned in the past, because the individual coil packs are set up very differently. And I can show you after I pull these plugs the difference, but the reality is you know, you just gotta kind of have confidence, you know, that you'll figure it out. As I showed a moment ago, I initially thought that the spark plugs were under this cover when they're really over here, which makes perfect sense. But like I said, I've never actually done one like this before, so it's close enough, and I understand motors enough that I knew that I could figure it out. So going through the process, we're basically learning a little bit together here. There's really not a whole lot of difference between this and the Chevelle or my pickup truck as far as the overall function, right? The motor is gonna fire the spark plug, and it's gonna make the compression cycle work, or not the compression cycle, the ignition cycle on the motor. So it's not hard. You know, like that PCV valve. That PCV valve is very different than the PCV valve on the Chevelle. It's very different than the ones that are on other vehicles that I've worked on. You know, the Chevelle actually doesn't even need a PCV valve, but I put one in there because of the architecture of what the PCV valve does. Helps me make sure that I'm not pulling motor oil into the intake and carburetor in the Chevelle. And I knew I was getting some blow by and installed it. But the bottom line is basically the same, that, you know, don't be afraid to try something. You know, take your general knowledge and extrapolate it out so that, you know, you can take care of the things that you need to take care of. Sometimes they might be a little bit more nuanced, and you know, somebody who doesn't have kind of a knowledge base of what all these components are doing may be a little gun shy to try to take care of it. But it's not really that hard. You just kind of have confidence in yourself that you'll figure it out. You know, I haven't actually looked at this from a perspective of, oh, let me get on YouTube or all that to see if I can find a video on the how-to. I just kind of did it, and it's going just fine. All right, so all the plugs are out, and I'll briefly explain to you the difference here. Right, so we talked about the spark plugs, they go in here, and we talked about the individual coil packs that go on top of the plug, and then these plug into each individual coil pack, and the computer tells the spark plugs, well, actually tells the coil packs when to fire the spark plugs. The coil packs are usually capacitors, and they hold electricity inside of them, so that every time that this is telling it to fire, it's not sending all the electricity that it needs to fire that plug. It's triggering it to do so. That's very different than the Chevelle, whereas with that, it's all computer controlled, and each coil pack is set up so that it fires when the computer tells it to. This is all mechanically driven, and right here, this is the spark plug right here. This is one of the 8 spark plugs. You can see on each side, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it's 4 more on the other side. And this right here is actually the one individual coil. This is the coil pack. And what happens is that runs to the distributor, and then that's based on a gear that's down in the motor. And as the motor rotates, it spins that distributor, and that's what tells it when the spark plug to fire. So that's a whole different ball of wax as far as timing and everything is concerned, and getting that all wired correctly. And as you can see, this is actually more of a pain in the butt to do, because I got to pull each wire, I got to run all the wires, I got to set the timing on the distributor, make sure the coil pack is right and working, and then set the timing up here on the camshaft, or the crankshaft rather. So it's a lot more involved than simply popping out the plugs and checking them and then putting new ones back in and letting the computer do its job. All right, so I got all the plugs out. We're going to look at them real quick, and we can see that if we look at them all, these plugs are in pretty decent shape. I didn't check the gap on them, which is something that I'll do. But as far as the burn, see how they all have the same kind of brown, kind of coffee color hue to them. That means that they're all running good, that this is a pretty healthy motor, and I'll show you how to check the gap. But the thing is that when you look at, say, a new plug, these are the same plugs that came out of it. You can compare the two, and I'll check the gap on these guys, but you can see that they look essentially the same as far as the architecture is concerned. Maybe there's some rounding of the electrode on this one, like right there. You can see how there's a little bit of buildup right there, but overall these are pretty healthy plugs. These are definitely not plugs that had been in here for 120,000. They probably have about 20,000 miles on them. So I could leave these in here, but again, spark plugs aren't expensive, so I'm going to go ahead and replace them. Again, this is what a healthy spark plug should look like. This is the coloration that you would want. It's not built up. If it was crusty and chalky and white, that means that the motor's running too lean. It means that there's not enough fuel getting into the cylinder, and as you would expect with a computer-controlled system, the computer takes care of that, and it has sensors and making sure that there's a knock sensor to make sure that it's not running too lean. So that's not going to be a problem, and there's no oil on them, so we know that we don't have a lot of blow-by. And this is what one that came out of the Chevelle prior to the rebuild that was running a little rich, and you can see the difference between these guys. First of all, it's way bigger, and the electrode's way bigger. They're just a more robust setup, and it wasn't running too rich, but it definitely was running richer than it is now with the optimal setup. And when I pulled the plugs from the Chevelle, they look more like the old plugs here from the Acura. But this is what a plug that you pull is that's too rich. And the old timers, you know, back with the Chevelle and stuff, what they would do is they'd pull these plugs and check what we're just talking about. They'd read the plugs, and that would help them set timing and fuel and figure out, you know, is it running rich, is it running lean? But we can look at these and we can tell that those plugs are pretty good, pretty good. So what I want to do next is check the old gap, and what that'll do is tell me, you know, how well that motor is actually running. And I know from looking up the specs on this vehicle that the gap of these spark plugs should be about 0.044 inches. So that's what I got here, is I got a feeler gauge with that setup. So I added these two together, added more than two together. So I got 40 and 4, and I check that gap, and that gap is too small. So these guys were running too small. Sorry, getting it out of the picture here, trying to see this gap isn't quite right. So these are the new ones. I'll check it on there. That gap is still too small, doesn't fit in there. So I know I need to re-gap these. All right, so we checked the gap, and as I showed you before, I want it to be 0.44 inches gap, and this is just a little too tight. So you get these guys, and you gotta be careful because you can see that tip's very small, but you get one of these and you bend it out a little bit like this. See how it opened it up? It's going to be too big now, but that's fine. See, now it's too big. That's why I have this guy here. What you do is you put the spark plug in here, and you tighten this guy down just a little bit at a time. And this is nice because the other way is to kind of take this and you bend it out, and then you kind of try to bend it out, and then you push it back in with your finger, and you just kind of hope that you're getting it right. But this is nice because I can turn it and check it. And see if I got that gap right. So it's still not quite right. It's a little big. Give it a little turn. It's close. Nope, not yet. So I got a little bit of friction right there. Still a little big. Now, the reason that you want these gaps to be the way that they are, I mean, you can see how thin that piece of metal is, and the tolerances are what they are for two reasons. Well, really just one. The reality is that that gap is good now. So I'll open it up, and it tests then the spring back a little bit after. So I'll check it after I pull it out. You can see that I'm pretty much right on the money for that. But anyway, you want to check these gaps, because what happens is that gap controls spark duration and intensity. So if the gap is too small, what happens is the spark happens very quickly. It's a short spark. It doesn't get very hot, and it can make the fuel not burn as efficiently or even all the way. So if it's too small of a gap, you can run into issues with fuel efficiency and power loss because it's not burning all the fuel. Now, if the gap is too big, what can happen is it's based off of resistance in the air, right? So the electrical charge has to break the resistance between the tip of that electrode to the cathode and make sure that it's able to jump that resistance through the air. And if it's too big of a gap, there's too much resistance, it may not jump that gap, or it may jump that gap too slowly, and you, of course, can get a misfire. So that's why the gap is important. So I'm going to go ahead and put all the gap together on the rest of these spark plugs, and we're going to pop them back in the car. So the other thing to look at is to consider the sameness a good sign too. That again, we look at these, we can tell that they all look about the same. That sameness is another sign that the coils are in good working order. Each coil is working independently. It's not like the Chevelle where there's one coil that does all the spark plugs. So looking at them and seeing that they all look about the same shows that, again, like that the motor's in good, healthy working order, but that the coils are doing their job, that each individual coil is doing its job. So I don't have to worry about replacing those coils. You can test the coils and go through that process, but this is a quick and dirty way to get a feel that the coils are doing what they're supposed to. All right, so got them all gapped right. We're going to go ahead and put these back in. Remember, use that spark plug socket. It likes to hold it in place for you. If it falls out, don't stress, but tighten it by hand until it goes all the way and you can't tighten it by hand anymore. And those spark plugs, as you saw, are pretty long threads, so it takes a lot of turns. But anyway, tighten it down so it's finger tight. I got that finger tight, and then what you want to do is you can do it two ways. You can get it down to finger tight, and then what they say is you can take the regular wrench and give it 1/2 turn. Different motors, different spark plugs have different characteristics, but the idea is that once it's finger tight, these washers right here, they crush based on that torque and are what makes sure that they don't leak. So all the pressure inside the cylinder stays in the cylinder, and these crush washers are what are going to help keep that all sealed in there. Alternatively, like I said, you can do that, but they always give you a torque spec. I have a torque wrench, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. It's just more accurate. So I went, like I said, all the way down, and I'm going to turn this. I set it to the 15 foot-pounds that they recommend, and I turn it until it clicks. See that little click? That's how I know it's torqued to where it's supposed to be. All right, super easy. And then, like I said, I got these guys back in order. So I just put this one back on top. Give it a little wiggle so that it engages the plug. Not happy with how tight that's getting. All right, so that's in. Then I connect it. I put the bolts on, and good there. Then you just button it up. I'll do the rest and then put the cover back on, and job's done. Anyway, miss you guys. Love you. All right, so quick smart lesson here. That real briefly looked like that coil pack wasn't going in, and the reason it wasn't going in is because this grommet actually came out of the socket and was stuck on the spark plug inside the motor. So I had to get a tool and hook it. You can see where it ripped, pull that out. But it's just smart lesson, you know. Take your time. If something doesn't feel right, don't force it. Check why it's not doing what you think it should. And that's what was going on there. It just wasn't acting appropriately, so I stopped and checked out what was going on. So as you can see, I've got all the spark plugs in. Got the one in and hooked up already. So these should go in much nicer now. So see, snaps right in. And this goes right on. And then I put the bolts in. Like I said earlier, I'll start these by hand. It's always a good idea, especially because all this is aluminum. Start it by hand, and then I'll tighten them all down. But I wanted to kind of give you that smart lesson real quick. The other interesting thing is, you know, I was thinking about it while I was eating lunch. You know, that gap is so small, right? And that change is so small. When you look at these feeler gauges, I mean, the reality is between, you know, 30 thousandths and 40 thousandths, you know, there's not a whole lot of difference. You know, you can see, and they're super thin. And the reason why it matters so much, and, you know, you want to go 44 and not 40 or 50 thousandths, is simply because if you think about it, if that motor's running at 6,000 RPM, that's revolutions per minute. So that's 6,000 times that crankshaft turns completely over per minute. That means that every second that crankshaft is spinning 100 times at 6,000 RPM. So that crankshaft is turning 100 times every second. And then every rotation of the crankshaft, there are 2 of the cylinders that fire, and the 4-cylinder, basically half of them fire at every rotation. So the Chevelle, being a V8, 4 cylinders fire at every rotation of the crankshaft, and 2 cylinders fire on this Honda. And what that means is that every second, when your car's saying that it's traveling at the motor's running at 6,000 RPM, every second this spark plug is firing 50 times a second. So that's why those gaps, that seems like a very small difference, but that's why that gap is important. Anyway, this was a way longer video than I thought it was going to be. I hope you enjoyed it. Love you guys. Miss you.